Okay, we're going to get started for the 3:30 Pizza Dough Boot Camp, where we're going to be talking about steps in the processes of making dough. Now, before we start, the first thing both Bill and I and Tim would like to do, this morning was very crowded. We didn't expect that many, and we apologize, honest to God, to anybody who had to stand or sit on the floor. We, honest to God, apologize. We made sure we had more chairs here today, and it'll be the same way tomorrow. So please accept our apologies on that. As far as the do's and don'ts, cell phones, if you can mute them, that would be terrific. If you have a call, obviously we know you're busy, you're away from your businesses and stuff. Please take them outside, join us again. And feel free to ask us questions. It goes a lot easier. It's great for us when we ask. We learned some stuff today from the gentleman over here with the semolina. Ask us questions. We'll answer as many as we can. We do want to respect your time. It's been a long day for everybody. I know you guys, some of you got to be pretty tired. We want to keep it to that 90-minute window. So, we'll do our best to that. And if you have a question, by all means, we'll be happy to answer it. If you don't have a booklet, raise your hand or come back out, come up. We have a bunch of them here.
Even if you need a few more for your teams at home, don't be afraid to grab a couple if you need to. I don't know how many we brought, but they were really heavy.
Yeah.
So they're pretty sure not going back.
Well, while you guys are coming up, we'll do a quick reintroduction of both Bill and myself. My name's Tom Santos. I've been with General Mills 21 years. I started in 1980 as a baker in a small town in Connecticut. Ran a bakery for 18 years. Full-line bakery, bread, rolls, pastry, cakes, you name it, we made it. So I have a 40-year experience with dough, making doughs, handling doughs, cake batters, and learned a lot from this guy next to me. I met Bill 10 years ago.
12,
and I've learned so much. I thought after 25, 27 years of being in the business, I knew I've learned a lot from Bill. Bill is terrific. That's a little background about me. I cover national flour for General Mills, and it's been a great ride. You're in a great industry, and you should have a lot of fun. We want a lot of questions. We want to share a lot of stories. Learnings are great, and hopefully have a few laughs. And like I said this morning, when I started in 1980, there was a gentleman here who had very long hair and a pony. That's the way my hair was like down to here. And now every year I just parted on a different side. So that's my story.
Turns his head to the opposite direction. My name's Bill Weekley. I've been doing this since 1966. I worked for a lot of different in-store bakeries, a lot of retail bakeries, a lot of wholesale bakeries. I've owned 2 bakeries in partnerships. Fortunately, both of them are still alive, but I didn't go to that extreme. The thing that I'm doing, I worked for a yeast company for 24 years, so I have a pretty good background in yeast manufacturing or growing, as well as a tech service rep. I was out there for a long time covering North America. Right now I am an R&D engineer in Minneapolis for General Mills, and I work on flour, cakes, cream cakes, muffins, just about anything. Currently, whatever I work on, my wife has to tolerance test. So I try to make it right the first time, because the rides home can be miserable if you mess it up. But the one person that we didn't introduce this morning was Tim Trainer. Tim is here kind of working as our shadow. You see the name Dominator on a lot of things for General Mills, and we're trying to bring him along. Fortunately, he's considerably younger than either Tom or I. So he's going to be around for a little while.
Yeah.
But you want to introduce yourself?
20 years with the company, various roles. I'm one of our corporate chefs, work on our culinary team. I have large chain customers. I work with QSRs and C-stores. So I see a lot of the stuff that I see. They're not as technical in a lot of their asks when it comes to the background and what they need, but they are probably more cumbersome and troublesome when it comes to having the troubles with that, because it's not one location, it's 8,000 or 10,000 or 12,000. So when it rains, it pours in my world, and so I rely on him. I rely on him from his expertise as well, because he's in probably one of the most hostile markets. As I call it. So I don't go out there just because I know that he's out there, but like I say with these guys and everybody else, it's just food, right? And you wouldn't be doing this if you didn't have passion for it, and I'm very passionate about our customers, and I'm very passionate about stepping into this role, because 50 years of him doing this, I wasn't born when he started, not just saying anything about that. But,
Most people weren't.
Yeah, I was.
You were.
We got a lot of knowledge to put in my tiny brain, so I'm being a sponge.
Yeah, come on. Do you need a booklet? If you need a booklet, grab one.
Another one?
Sure.
Same one or different one?
Same one.
Same one. We're going to do a dough making demo. We had one today, and second time in my life in 40 years I saw a hook break.
Somebody was trying to go too fast.
We got a message because the hook was going, and I looked at Bill, and Bill looked at me, and all of a sudden half the hook was in the dough, and the other thing was just spinning around. So we had to cancel the second dough demo. We have a FedEx overnight hook coming in.
Hopefully it'll be here at 10:30 in the morning, so we'll be ready for the noon class.
Right, so we'll be doing 2 tomorrow, and hopefully you could stop by. And if you did both sessions, the morning and the afternoon, you'll get a lot out of that. Because what we're talking about this afternoon, the scaling and how to mix dough, when you see it on the TV as Bill mixes the dough, it'll make a lot more sense to you. So if you have questions, feel free to ask, and I am glad to see there's some seats for people to sit down. So you want to make dough. That's the name of the slide, and we talk about it. It's 4 basic steps. And if you don't scale your ingredients right, the other 3 steps become a major problem. Scaling ingredients is probably, other than temperature, the number one problems Bill, myself, and Tim will see when we get questions about dough not working well. When you scale ingredients, you're scaling by weight, and I'm going to get into that on the next slide. Scaling ingredients, mixing, when you're dispersing it like we were doing before, dispersing it, mixing it to the correct amount of time so you have the gluten development. Then Bill will talk about the fermentation and some of the makeup. This is scaling ingredients is something very like I said, I owned a bakery for a long time, and every now and then, instead of scaling, you throw a scoop in, and I understand that. We've lived your life, okay? Somebody put too much water in the dough, so you just open a bag and throw a scoop of flour in to make it work. We get that. But if you scale your ingredients by weight, and you do it all the time, see on the bottom there it says consistency equals quality. Your goal is to have every person who comes into your store say, you know what, I got a pizza there 2 months ago. It's the same as it was today. Or I'm going to have the same pizza there two years from now. If you scale your ingredients correctly, you're going to go a long way to accomplishing that. And the reason when I say by weight, a cup is a unit of measure. 8 ounces is a weight. So if, say I was, and I'm going to do, this drives me, I'm Italian. I'm sorry. If you weigh something, like Bill weighs a pound on a scale, like one of those triple beam, the electric scales, or a regular balance scale. If Bill weighs a pound, and I weigh a pound, and anyone in here weighs a pound, it's a pound. We know it's a pound. But if you take 2 cups and weigh it, Bill's might be 14 ounces. Mine might be 17 ounces. A cup is volume, not an actual volume, not an actual weight. So if you're not weighing stuff by a scale, you're doing sort of a little disservice as far as the consistency of your dough. And we always tell a few stories about some of the things we see out there. There's I had a customer who was having problems with dough, and I said, well, tell me what you do. He says, well, what I do is I use 2 Dunkin' Donuts cups for the salt, and I use a Starbucks cup for the sugar. And they use it all the time. And you know what? Not bad. I mean, at least they're using something that's a measurable volume. But 2 cups could vary as much as 5 to 8% on every dough. If your dough is off 1%, not a big deal. If your dough is off 5%, the other three things we're going to talk about, the mixing, the fermentation, it just cascades down as you go along. A lot with the salt and sugar, people use cups for the salt and sugar, like I said. The yeast, a lot of people use tablespoons. I could tell you my tablespoon, your tablespoon, and especially with yeast, because yeast, if you're using an instant yeast, and you go from 0.25% to 0.5%, there's going to be a big difference in your dough. And you may wonder why your dough is blowing out the next morning. Well, it could be somebody else mixed the dough and they just had a heavy hand with the yeast. But if you weigh out 1 ounce, it's 1 ounce every time. So we can't stress enough how to use a scale, an actual scale using weight. Now, my favorite one is oil. And the oil, this is like the greatest story ever. And I was asking somebody how to use, how do they make their dough? And they said, well, I put the water in, and then I put the flour in, and then I put the oil in. I said, well, how much oil do you use? He goes, I use 3 glug-glugs. I'm like, what the hell is a glug-glug? So he takes the oil, he takes the thing, he opens it up, he goes, glug, glug, glug. So Bill and I think in April, we're going to get together and see how much weight an actual glug-glug is. We don't want to be doing glug-glugs. We want to weigh the oil. We wanted to know, if you're using 2 pounds of oil, it's 2 pounds of oil. My guess is a glug-glug is about 10 ounces.
I got no clue.
Yeah.
But one thing to keep in mind, too, is think about recipes that you got from your mother or your grandmother, and you try to replicate them in your kitchen at home, and they don't come out. Something's really wrong with them. There's a reason for that. Number one, Grandma was kind of sneaking in a little extra stuff on the side, I'm sure. But there is not a definitive size for a cup or a tablespoon on the market today. The FDA and the USDA like to say that an 8-ounce cup is a cup. But there are liquid measures and there are dry measures. But neither of them require you to require the manufacturer of those things to actually be 8 ounces of dry or 5.5 ounces of dry, like flour generally is about. So if you have 5 different utensils in your kitchen that are completely different manufacturers, you can never be accurate. Does anybody use ice cream scoops? The little clicky ice cream scoops? 2 different manufacturers can be off by 5 to 7 ounces, or 5 to 7 grams on the exact same thing. That's 1/4 ounce. Doesn't sound like a lot, but if you're using that to measure your sugar or salt, that's huge. So just keep that in mind. Scales are reasonably inexpensive until you get up to the big ones like that. That's about a $2,500 scale. It's huge.
But
for a regular scale that you're using for minor ingredients like sugar and salt, you can buy them for as little as $20.
And it'll save you, again, that consistency equals quality. When you're talking, like Bill said, the yeast, the sugar, and the salt, a 4 or 5% difference is going to make a big impact down the road as you mix the dough and ferment it. Did you have a question?
That one goes to 35 or 30. We have tons of them, and we get them recalibrated about every 6 months.
And those are important too for water.
Yep.
Water is huge, obviously, and Bill talked about it this morning. We'll be talking about it later too. Water, if you don't have the right amount of water, we were talking about Baker's percent this morning. So if you fill your 4-quart pitcher up, and you think you have 8 pounds in the 4-quart pitcher roughly, but if you fill it a little higher, what happens? You have 8.5 pounds. So instead of 56%, now all of a sudden you're putting 4 of those in, you got 58%, your dough is going to be off. And if you're making the dough all the time, or you're not making the dough all the time, you have somebody else making the dough, they may not fill it to the top. So your water could vary 5 or 6%. not only does it affect your dough, it affects your bottom line. If you're putting less water in your dough, and say you're 2 dough balls less, say you're 2 pounds less of water, that's money out of your pocket. Water is free in most places, but it's a lot less expensive than flour. That's why it's so important to physically weigh that water out. And, we see it all, the buckets with the lines, and that, you know what, I would never criticize that, because at least you're trying to get a standard unit of measure. But if you weigh out the water, your dough is going to be consistent. And as a former business owner, there is nothing more frustrating than having to throw out a dough or having customers say, geez, the pizza this time, or whatever product you're making, geez, it wasn't just like last time. You scale your ingredients and you use temperature like Bill's going to go over, 95 to 99% of that's going to go away.
Another funny one on water is our previous partner who retired had a story about a guy in Chicago that had purchased a pizzeria and had purchased the recipe from them. And the recipe was actually mounted on the wall in the restaurant. And we were trying to figure out how much water this guy was adding to his dough. Well, he went back in the back room and he grabbed the hose off the side of the wall and he stuck the hose in the bowl, turned it on for 10 seconds, and then pulled it out and walked the hose back. That's how he determined how much water was in his dough every day. And he was so far off every day because the pressure changed every day that he could not make a dough 2 days in a row that was the same.
And that's why we're going to stress, and you're going to hear it
A lot.
30 times today, consistency equals quality. And consistency, to do it right, may take you another minute per dough. If you do it wrong, it's going to take you 25 minutes to redo the whole thing. And you don't have to throw anything out. And your customers, every time they come in, are going to get the same pizza. And that's what you want. You want repeat customers are your best source of business. They're your best advertisement. But if somebody gets a bad pizza with social media, oh my God, I mean, it's like you can't make a mistake. But if you could limit the ability to make a mistake, that's what we're trying to get at here. The suggested order, and we'll go through it with the following slides. You put your water in the bowl. Then you're going to put your dries for a short mix to hydrate the flour, and then use the oil to finish it. We were doing that today at the booth, and then the mixer broke. So
somebody didn't put enough water in the dough, I don't think.
That's showbiz, as they say, right? Okay, and that, for those of you who don't know, Bill was a hand model before. You could see how nice he is. That's water in the bowl. Now you're going to add all your dry ingredients. So you're going to, except in this order, you're going to add your salt, sugar, flour. If you're using instant yeast, put it on top. You don't want the instant yeast to contact the water before you mix it. Then mix your dough for about 45 seconds. All we want to do is hydrate the protein in the dough. So if you put oil, if you're using oil, and you put oil on top of the water, and the flour hits it, what happens is you're coating the protein strands. So all the dough that hits that oil before it's hydrated is going to have the protein strands coated. It's not going to affect the dough that much, but you're not going to get a great stretch on it. You're paying for the protein. You're paying for a high protein flour. Even if you're using a winter wheat, mid protein or lower protein flour, if you allow the dough to do what it's supposed to do, the water to hydrate the dough, hydrate the protein, then add your oil. The oil could then use it. Bill talked about it this morning. The oil will be an extendability for your protein and your gluten. You'll find the dough will stretch a little better. It's a minor thing for anybody who owns a pizza restaurant. If you're using oil and water to start, just hold off on the oil for 45 seconds. Mix it. Looks like a cookie dough. Just pie dough. Add your oil and mix it out as you normally would. You'll notice, if you do them side by side, you'll notice a little bit better stretch on the dough. But add the oil and continue. Yes?
What did you say about the tying on the instant yeast?
You don't want, instant yeast, you don't want to contact initially with water. You want to put it on top of the flour because as it mixes and disperses, it breaks up and it'll give you a better performance out of it.
I remember I told you in the afternoon that I
Use active dry.
Yeah, I tried
Yep.
I mix it too.
That's okay.
That's different. That's when you're using a portion of the water, not the entire amount of the water in the formula.
I use a portion to put it with yeast, but
Yep.
I heat up the water to 85 Fahrenheit, and
Yep.
then I start bubbling it. I make bubbles and I add it.
Right. But you add your water first.
I add my water first, and mix it for about 45 seconds, and then I put my yeast.
The yeast mixture inside that?
Yeah.
That's fine.
That's fine. But all you want to make sure is that the dough gets hydrated, whether you're using instant yeast or active dry or regular yeast.
One of the reasons that we ask you not to add the instant yeast directly to the water is because there's going to probably be times of the year when you're going to have to use ice or much colder water to achieve the same dough temperature that you're supposed to be getting year round. If you put instant yeast on ice water, it's going to be just like you jumped into a lake in Minnesota at this time of year. It's not going to be happy, and it may destroy some of the yeast cells. So rather than taking a chance, just put that flour buffer between the water and the actual yeast itself.
In mixing, the function of mixing is to disperse the ingredients, get them all mixed up, blended together, and it's actually called stage one, is your blending stage. That's what it's actually referred to as. And we developed the protein network, the gliadin and the glutenin. We developed that, and that gives you your stretch of the dough. When you mix, and I talk about my netting again, and there's actually a slide, it's my favorite slide in this whole thing. You're developing that netting, you're developing that protein network that allows your dough to rise correctly, ferment correctly, and keep the CO2 gases that give the great flavor to the dough. Some mixing time factor, we got to change this. This mixer is like the worst picture of a mixer I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah.
That one, I don't know, it's like Star Wars, that mixer, but there's some mixing time factors. The flour protein. The stronger flour, you're going to have to mix it a little bit different, a little bit longer, because there's more gluten involved. The absorption rate, if you're using more water, it's going to affect your mixing time. Formulation, some people, especially like if you're mixing a deep dish pizza, you're using 14 or 18% oil. That's not going to mix that long before it's going to get very, very soft. Temperature is huge, especially, places that have 4 seasons, like where I'm from in the Northeast. When the temperature changes, you have to change your water, and Bill will be talking about that. But you have to change how long you mix it, because that bowl is going to get hot. When it's 100 degrees in the back room, that bowl is hot. And that's going to change the temperature of your dough, even though you're cooling it off. You may have to change your friction factor a little bit there. Mixer type, there's spiral mixers, there's planetary mixers. Most people use a 60 or 80 quart planetary mixer to mix. Depends on the type of mixer, will depend on the speed. If you're using an 80 quart mixer, a 50-pound bag of flour, it could roll at second speed pretty easy. 60 quart mixer it might struggle a little bit with a 50-pound bag of flour, and if you can mix it at first speed just a little bit longer. But like we talked about earlier this morning, the last thing we want to do is overmix a dough, because there's no coming back from overmixing a dough. If you undermix it a minute or two, that's fine. It's going to develop overnight when you retard it. But if you overmix it and destroy that protein network and the gluten network, that doesn't come back. And what you'll see when you overmix it, the dough is going to be warm when it comes out, but the next day it's going to come up. It's just going to flatten out because there's no protein structure to hold those gases in. We stole this from the first this morning's thing. We only changed the last box as far as mix time goes. Everything else is the same. You notice it says the protein level, the gluten strength, and dough strength. But notice the mixing time. The less protein, the less mix time. When you get into the bread flour, the patent flour, 7 to 10 minutes. Now these are kind of sort of suggestions, but when you start getting into the 14-minute 13, 14 minute on a high protein dough, that's sort of pushing it towards this little bit too much on the length of the mix. I mean, if you're in first speed, I could sort of get it. You want to be to the 10 and 11, 7 to 8, that type of mix time, because the dough will develop. You start getting to the 14 and over 15, you could get in trouble with that dough, especially if it's warm out. This is my slide, my favorite slide. This is the gluten, the gluten network, the basketball hoop, whatever you want to call it. When you mix flour, water, and start spinning it in the bowl, you develop gluten. Now the top, I think I could even, this thing here, that looks like spaghetti. That's your protein network when you first start mixing the dough. And we'll show you with some slides. We were trying to show it in the booth today. As the dough keeps mixing, you see how it develops into like that netting I was talking about? And when it's done, and you do the window painting that we were talking about at the booth today, you could look up and you could actually see that protein network. And when you could pull the dough apart, and we'll show you on a couple slides, and you see it developed, that you know that dough is going to rise slowly, the fermentation is going to be perfect. But in order to get to the fermentation, we got to make sure we scaled it right and mixed it right. So we talked about scaling. I'm going to go over a little bit on the mixing. Flour, water, mix equals gluten. This picture here is probably mixed for about 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes. The dough is just coming together. It's essentially paper mache. That's the end product you want. You could actually, if you come up close, you could actually see these little strands of protein. Now that's a small piece of dough, and when Bill did that, he pulled it out probably to about this big, maybe an ounce of dough, and it'll stretch like that if it's mixed correctly. So stage 1 was the blending stage. Stage 2 is the pickup stage. That's when, as your mixer's going around, the dough is mixing. We call it the pickup stage, the action of the mixer, and it causes the dough to pull away. You know, when you first start mixing, you have the flour on the side of the bowl, and it's just starting to come. Between the 2 and 4 or 5 minute mark, it starts pulling away from the bowl and starts forming that ball. When you get to that point and you pull out a piece of dough, you could see the gluten network is starting to come together. It's still bumpy. I mean, it's not a piece of window pane, nice stretchy dough. It's coming together very bumpy, very rough. The gluten network hasn't developed completely. At 6 minutes, that's towards the end of the pickup stage and into the cleanup stage. And that's pretty much, the dough starts becoming a little bit more elastic, the 6 to 8 minute mark. It's starting to form a good ball of dough. It's pulled away completely from the side. So as it's spinning in the mixer, you don't see any flour, anything on the side. The whole bowl is pretty clean. So when you pull it out after 6 minutes, you see it stretches a little bit more. You have a little bit more pull on the dough, but it's still a little bumpy. And bumpy is a technical word, I guess, but it hasn't developed completely. You're not to the point where you could say, I can make a dough out of that. At 8 minutes, this is the development stage, 8 to 10 minutes as far as a high protein flour goes. Very dry, silky, almost shiny, like a sheen on the dough. It's almost like a big piece of bubble gum is a way to put it. You could see on the bottom, this isn't quite done because if you look on the bottom here, you see how it's still tearing just a little bit there? Not quite developed, almost developed. But you see when Bill took out a piece there, you only have a little bit of tear right here. That dough is pretty much acceptable. You could use that dough, but if you spin it another minute or two, you'll get the final development. And that's it. You have the nice ball, extendability. It's almost dry to the touch. All the liquids have been absorbed. The dough is doing what it's supposed to do. When you touch it, it's not really sticky. It has a nice, dry, silky appearance. And when you pull a piece of dough out and stretch it, you could take that small piece of dough and stretch it that big. And that's telling you you have a perfect dough at that point. When you could stretch it and you look up at the light and you see those protein strands and it isn't ripping, your dough's mixed perfectly. You'll be able to refrigerate it overnight and you'll be in good shape. Do you have any questions on the first part, the mixing or the weighing of ingredients?
Would you recommend different mixing speeds for different applications?
When I mix, I'll usually go by the size of the mixer. If you're putting 50 pounds in a 60-quart mixer, some 60-quart mixers struggle with that. So you want to stay at the first speed rather than the second speed. If the mixer could take it, you know, the early stage, I see a lot of people start in first speed and then finish it off a little in second speed. But if you're moving up in speed, you got to cut down the time a little bit. Okay, Bill.
Any specific temperature for the oil?
No.
Room temperature?
Yeah.
Okay. Old guy coming. Okay. So what's going on in the dough? You've developed this gluten network, and now you're going to try to trap the CO2 or the gases that are produced by the yeast itself. That whole network, that basketball hoop network that you're building, allows the gas to be trapped by that gluten network, and it's what makes the dough be consistent from one side to the other, or front to back, or all the way across the dough. Yeast is going to create leavening action, or CO2. It'll produce flavor and aroma. You cannot get the same flavor from a pizza by using chemical leavenings like baking powder and cream of tartar and stuff like that. I remember as a kid growing up eating Appian Way pizza. I don't know if any of you have tasted that. I can't even believe that we ate that stuff. It was all chemically leavened and it was just not very pleasant. So stay away from the chem leaveners if you can. You'll find out that you're going to develop a much better flavor profile with yeast. And then it has a mellowing effect on the dough. So if your dough is coming right off the mixer, it's going to be very tight, like I explained earlier in the day. As the dough has fermented, it will get softer, it will get a little more gas in it, and it will stretch more efficiently, which will allow you to get a better looking pizza with more flavor in it. So the results for an optimum fermentation: good consistent volume, visible cell structure. If you cut into the side of the bone of the pizza on the outside of the crust, you should see some inconsistency to some degree. You don't want it to be perfect, but a little bit of bubbles, a couple of holes, some finer texture or grain, all of that is a positive outcome. And then you want a creamy white or a creamy yellowish color. If you're using semolina, it might have that little bit of yellow color to it. You want a nice golden crust. And you want a really full yeasty fermentation or fermented flavor profile. The non-optimum fermentation, which I've actually tried to do a lot, and at home seem to succeed at it quite well. But when I'm in pizzerias, I can make dough all day long and it always comes out right. But an over-fermented dough is going to be flat. It's going to have a very irregular open grain. It won't be consistently open grain throughout the entire pie. You'll have big bubbles in certain areas. You may actually have giant blisters or bubbles in the middle of the pie. A lot of times that will cause the actual dough, if you're in a conveyor oven or if you're in a fairly confined space oven, it's going to rip the top of the pizza right off. It's going to have a bad beer odor. That's like Falstaff beer from the 60s and 70s, which nobody really drank. They mostly just, you didn't drink it until you had too many of the first ones, and then you switched to the cheap stuff. It's going to have a gummy, grayish crumb. It's not very easy to work with. It'll be stuck to everything. If you're using totes or sheet pans to cool your dough, it literally, you'll have to scrape it off. It just doesn't come off. Even if you put oil on the pans to prevent it from sticking, it will still stick. And then a lack of browning. When the dough runs out of sugar, there's only two things for it to do. One is bake so that it has a white crust, or carbonize so it's burnt. There's no in between. It won't be golden brown. It'll just be either white or black. Under-fermented doughs are going to be flat, tight, dense grains, very dense grains. Usually it looks exactly the same all the way across the crust. They'll have a bland or unfermented flavor profile to them. They split like pita. When we make pita bread in the real world, we actually take pita bread down to about 1/8 of an inch thick and we run it through a 950 degree oven for 17 to 22 seconds. And it goes from that little 1/2 or 1/8 inch piece to a football, literally the size of a football, in a matter of that 17 to 22 seconds. Then they flatten them back out, put them in bags, and you guys eat them. And they'll have large flat bubbles. If you're running through a conveyor oven and you're having trouble with all those big giant bubbles and you've got the bubble popper out and you're banging on all of them and trying to get them down, it's probably because the dough is way under fermented. It needs more time, or it needs more time to warm up so it can do its job. So we're going to try to control the fermentation process. But how are we going to do that? There's temperatures, ingredients, and then time. Temperature control. Everybody has thermometers, right? If you don't, please spend the money on them. They are worth their weight in gold. And if you have a inspector or a food inspector that comes through and you don't have a thermometer in the place, they're going to be checking cheese temperatures, sauce temperatures, all sorts of things. And they may actually check your dough temperature. Some of them still do use infrared thermometers. I hate them. They're not very accurate for anything except checking metals. If you try to take the temperature of a dough with an infrared thermometer, that's the ones with the little beam on it, the only temperature you're going to get is the very skin. It's about 1/1000th of a millimeter. You're not going to get the actual temperature of the dough. So why is dough temperature so important? Well, an 18-degree difference in dough temperature can actually double the yeast activity in your dough. So if you have a 62-degree dough sitting next to an 80-degree dough, the 80-degree dough is actually going to ferment or proof or rise twice as fast as a 62-degree dough. This gives you a little bit of an idea. These dough balls were all mixed at the same time on 3 different mixers. One came out at 76, one came out at 88, and one came out at 96. They were exactly the same size dough balls. But you can tell there's a little bit of difference in them. And if you look at this actual chart here, you can see how much bigger the 88-degree dough ball is than the 76 or the 96. 96 is too hot. It already came up too far and is already starting to collapse on itself. 88 is ready to go. And 76 is too small and it's under fermented, so it doesn't have the volume that you're looking for. And this is the same thing with the 88 and the 96, giving it a little bit more comparison up close. So dough temperature is affected by a bunch of different things, but one is flour temperature, room temperature, bowl friction, and the actual water temperature. But which one's the easiest one to control? Yes. Your water temperature is the easiest, and it's the simplest variable to control. So, dough temperature is going to vary by the type of dough. It's going to vary by the type of the dough process. Are you going to be making dough for today? Are you going to be making dough for refrigerated dough? Are you going to be making frozen dough? Which I actually don't recommend to anybody in this room because it's a lot more complicated than you may think it is. Determining it, if you don't currently have some sort of a booklet, some sort of a notepad, something that you can track information on do yourself a favor and get one. And then try to track everything you can. Once you get back to the shop and you've kind of recovered from the insanity of this place, you're going to want to try to take a couple of weeks and actually write down everything that you're doing with your dough. Because you're going to have a couple of days where the doughs are going to be absolutely awesome. Those are the days you need to really keep track of. You're going to have some days that will be maybe not as good as those days, but they're still acceptable. And you may have a day or two where you just go, okay, we're starting over here. But don't be afraid of that. We all make mistakes. I make tons of them. Select the temperature that you're currently using for your dough if that's what you want to do. You may find it's too warm or too cold. Either way, find the temperature that works best for you under your circumstances. And they will change a little bit throughout the year. If you live where I live, and Tim lives, trying to mix a dough at 70 degrees this time of year, you could time that thing with a calendar. It's just not going to be very good. It's just going to be way too cold. But in the summertime, we may want them down around 70 or 75. So it's just something you kind of have to track and keep track of. And then when you run into issues where you're having problems, the easiest way to do things is to go back to the safe, grab that book out, because you never want that book to be out in the open where everybody can get to it, and pour oil all over it, and pour water all over it, or set a dough on top of it, and destroy the information that's in there. Just try to keep as accurate a records as you can, and you'll solve most of your own issues. If you're still having issues and you're really freaked out by it all, we have an 800 number at the end of this booklet, and we will be more than happy to help you as much as we can. After this show, I usually get about 40 to 60 phone calls over the next 30 days. But I'm going to be on my honeymoon the end of March, so you're not going to hear from me for that week. Okay, dough formula also has effect on it. The type of the dough process. This is how you can calculate your dough temperature, the water temperature to achieve a dough temperature of, in this particular case, 80 degrees. You're going to want to take the temperature of the flour. You're going to want to take the temperature of the room. Does anybody know why we take the temperature of the room? It's actually pretty easy, but no one ever thinks about it. The only reason you want to know the temperature of the room is because that's the temperature of the bowl you're going to be mixing in. What's that?
Unless it came out of the dishwasher.
Yeah, that's kind of a bummer. And then you're going to try to develop some sort of a friction factor. And friction factor is the amount of heat generated within that dough during the mixing process. You've got a hook pushing dough up against the outside of the bowl. If you're mixing a cake batter, it might be 0 because it's not really a whole lot of energy being dispersed on that. If it's being done in a Hobart, or we should use the term vertical mixer rather than Hobart, but because there's a lot of them on the floor. You may find that you're going to want to run somewhere between 25 and 35 as a friction factor. It is a swag number. Does everybody know what a swag is? That's a scientific wild-ass guess. If you're using a spiral mixers, generally speaking for bread doughs, don't generate a lot of heat, but they're not as stiff as most pizza doughs. So on a pizza dough, you may have to run as high as 40. But the key is to take those 3 items, add them together. In this particular case, you got 178. You've got 3 factors you're working with. You got 80 degrees is your ideal temperature. You multiply the 80 degrees by 3 because you got 3 factors you're working with. Comes out to 240. Subtract the 178 from that. Now you've got 62 is the water temperature that you need to achieve a finished dough temperature of 80 degrees. Or You can cheat and use that machine, that little calculator. It works pretty darn close. I won't say that it's 100% all the time accurate. There are many times when I'm doing cake batters that I will change what my number is supposed to be because it's colder in the morning than it is in the afternoon. And I might add 3 or 4 degrees to it. If you're running pizza doughs and your shop is at 60 degrees because you don't really leave the heat on at night because your oven is cooling down and you can kind of keep it warm with that rather than turning on the heat, you may have to run a slightly warmer water temperature in the morning. But once the shop gets up to the normal temperatures, you just adjust for it that way. Yes?
Is that supposed to be flour temperature?
Flour temperature and the shop temperature. Yep. And all you do is just 74, 74, boom, 62. You're good to go.
We actually have a big slide on that. If you email us, we can
Yeah.
shoot it out.
I've got a larger one, and I've got one that we put together down in Puerto Rico that's, oh my God, it's two-sided. And their shop is refrigerated. So it makes a special slide. I think there's 20 numbers across on one side, 20 down on the other side. And there may be that many on the other side because I had to do a winter-summer one for them. Yes?
On the previous slide, where's the 3 coming?
The 3 is pretty simple. You're working with 3 factors. You've got room temperature, flour temperature, and friction factor. You're just trying to adjust for that. Fermentation time. The age of the dough. Generally on a fresh dough, you're looking at about 3 to 12 hours. That's the kind of doughs that are made in a lot of bars today, where they run a dough in the morning. That dough will sit all day long. And they'll just take out hunks of dough and make it up as the people get drunker throughout the day. So the older it gets, the less they care. That's kind of how it works, but I have to be a smartass sometimes. It's just my job. And for a retarded or a refrigerated dough that you're setting up into dough balls in advance and you're cooling them down overnight, you're not using the dough for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days. Retard time is usually 12 to 72 hours. It rarely goes much beyond 3. It might be for lunch on day 4, but that's about it. Yeast levels on fresh doughs are much higher, but they're also more inconsistent because they are higher in yeast. They tend to ferment very, very quickly throughout the day, and you may find that you have to throw a dough away at some point and actually make a fresh dough because it's just moving too fast. On refrigerated or retarded doughs, much lower yeast levels because of the time that you're running. If you remember earlier today, I said if you're trying to go longer in the cooler, you need to use less yeast. There's only so much food for the yeast in that dough. So if you try to add too much yeast up front, the dough will burn out and it will turn to that over-fermented dough that's stuck to the pan and is just not making you a happy camper. Dough temperatures. For fresh dough, you're usually somewhere between 85 and 95. I've seen them as high as 105, almost to the point where you don't want to touch the dough until it cools down a little bit. But they move really quick. Fermentation, or the retarded time, is usually fairly slow. Yeast levels are fairly low. You're trying to get some time on the dough so it has a much more flavorful end result to it. You've got lactic acid, you've got acetic acid that you're working with during different time frames and at different temperatures. And if you can allow that dough to rest for a little bit at room temperature, you're going to build up one type of acid, and as it cools, it will build another, so you'll have more of a complex flavor profile. The whole idea behind the fresh dough is to produce multiple or smaller batches of dough throughout the day so that they meet your production needs. Maybe you're open for lunch at 11 o'clock and you just want to have pizzas available for everybody. So you mix the dough up at 10 o'clock. By 11 o'clock, it's actually ready to go. you can actually make pizza doughs out of it. Now, as the day goes by, like I said earlier, the flavor profile will change dramatically as it goes through. But you're able to maintain a fresh dough supply without having to worry about refrigerating all of that extra dough. That was easy. We just did that. The great part about fresh dough is that it does not require you to have large coolers, large refrigeration units. You're not having to share it with other things that are in the cooler. So here's the basic principle on how the fresh dough method is done. You mix the dough, you ferment it for 60 to 90 minutes, you either make the dough up, you can actually put it in a cooler if you choose to at that point, but it's not going to be in there for long before it starts trying to knock on the door to open the cooler back up. You proof the dough, or you make it up first, you proof it 30, 60 minutes, and then you use it or you hold it. So if you're making up dough at, let's say, 1 o'clock in the afternoon for a 4 or 5 o'clock meeting or get to opening, you can make it up, you can get it thinned out on the skins and then put them in the cooler and they will last, but they probably will not last you through the night. You may have to pitch them at the end of the night, or maybe you make breadsticks out of them because they're not going to be much good for pizza at that point. Garlic can hide anything. See, I am kind of a smart aleck. Sorry. Yes, ma'am. Proofing can be done a couple of ways. You can put it into a proofing cabinet if you choose to. You can proof it right out in the open just by putting plastic wrap on the actual individual skins. The other way to do it is to take a big, large white plastic bag and flip it over the top of it and trap the air. That works pretty well. If you're doing like a 15 high rack, that's a simple way to do it. When I bake at home, which is not that often anymore, I actually have a very deep plastic, one of those storage tubs, and I just set that over it, stick a cup of water in the microwave, heat it up, stick it under the thing. It works awesome. You can also use a dishwasher. Take the rack out of the top, run the rinse cycle, put the stuff in on top of that, and it works really good. Yeah, yeah. I remember my mother-in-law in Florida, she wanted to not use any sort of chemicals on the ants and the creatures that are quite large down there. And she would store all of her cereal and crackers in the oven. And she burnt her house down. It was just too funny, I'm sorry. She didn't get hurt, nobody got hurt. It was just the house, just ash. Retarded doughs, you can produce the dough off hours. So if you're going in the morning, you want to make dough for the next day, you can pop it out right off the bat, or you can work on your vegetables and your meats and your cheeses and all of that sort of stuff. Work that dough in the afternoon, which is usually a much more convenient time to do it. Make the doughs up, get them scaled or divided, round them, put them on racks or pans or however it is you're going to store them, Cambro trays. Get them into the cooler, usually within about 30 minutes. If you're using Cambro trays, you're going to want to cross stack them so you get full airflow all the way through each tub so it doesn't turn into the giant slab of stuff in the bottom of the pan that is fixing to take over like the giant tomato did there. They will hold for an extended period of time. You have to figure out for yourself what yeast amount you want to hold them for. So if you want a 3-day shelf life on the dough, you may only be using 0.2% instant yeast. If you want them to go for 24 or 36 hours, you might be able to get away with 0.4 or 0.5% yeast. If you want them to go 5 or 6 days, talk to me after the show, because we'll have to talk about other stuff. It's a lot more complicated than you think. The great part about this is it's a very stable way to hold dough until you're ready for it. You should actually allow those dough balls to come out of the cooler for a certain period of time before you try to use them, or you will have bubbling and blistering for the first couple days. When you get up to day 3 and 4, it's a little bit less. But that's kind of the whole thing. It does require dough temperatures to be fairly accurate from day to day and batch to batch. It's really important that you mark the trays or the totes so that you know when they were made, date, time, everything. They do take up a lot of cooler space this way. But it also requires you to have some dough management skill, which means how much yeast or how much dough did I make last year at this time? How much has my business increased over the last year? All the types of things that you have to be kind of aware of. But it's not so crazy that you have to worry, oh my God, I'm going to run out of dough balls in 2 hours. There are a lot of companies that make pizza dough in this country that will make enough dough to last them for the next day. And when they run out, it's Miller time. They just take a break. And it does upset the customers sometimes, but there'll be a big line outside the door the next day waiting to get in to get your next dough. It's amazing how well they work. Some of the advantages, it minimizes the actual need for accurate production from day to day, because you can kind of guesstimate what you're going to do from day to day based on what your previous year was. It might even be your previous couple of days. Sometimes things just change overnight and you don't realize it's going to happen. So it helps to have that information. It gives you a really good, consistent level of dough. The dough itself is much, much better than a fresh dough is, because that consistency is there. The flavor is there. The handling characteristics are all there.
When you store your dough too, especially in a walk-in, and Bill and I was talking about it this morning, you want to try and stay away from the door, because every time you open the door, you're getting a big temperature swing on your dough. If you can stay a little farther back in your cooler, you're going to have a more consistent product.
So on your last batch for the night, let's say you take your tray out and you don't sell the last tray or you sell half of it. Is there a formula applied to that one batch that you put back in the fridge for the next day? Because obviously it sat out for an hour, maybe 2, and it had fermented a lot.
The great part about refrigerated dough is it doesn't ferment a lot. Okay. It's very much a slower process. Now, if it's 90 degrees in the pizzeria, stuff is moving.
Have you ever put it in a fridge where the temperature is controlled at 62 degrees and then you just kind of leave it there?
That's more of an artisan type of baking method. If I was going to do that, I would definitely sheet the skins out, put them on pans, cover them, get them in the cooler, and use them first the next day, rather than actually going through the process of just trying to make a dough ball last overnight. It's kind of running out of oxygen at that point. Yeah. Yes.
What about if your pizzeria is outdoors and it's summer? Like, should I just take the dough from the fridge?
You still should let it set out a little bit first. What that time frame is, I don't know based on what I've currently heard.
San Diego weather, like
San Diego.
I'd kill to live in San Diego weather.
You know what? Bill and I will come down for a week into San Diego.
We'll practice with you. But only in the winter. I've done a lot of work with pizzerias in Jamaica and Puerto Rico, Mexico. It's still the same principle. It's just maybe a little bit more controlling over how you do things and how long you do them for.
before rounding the balls, isn't it better to just keep everything together for the yeast to work together?
Do you want to allow the dough to rest in bulk before you start dividing it up into dough balls? Is that what you're asking? It depends on what the dough temperature came out at. If you came off too hot, you're going to want to make it up soon or find friends. If it came off too cold, certainly you can let it relax a little bit longer and try to adjust to equilibrate to the temperature that you want. But in general, 10, 15 minutes, divide it, round it, get it in the cooler. This is kind of the procedure that goes through the refrigerated or retarded method. Basically, you're going to mix the dough. Usually takes about 5 to 8 minutes, 5 to 9 minutes. After it comes out, let it rest for 15 to 30 minutes. 30 to me is a little bit long unless you're really fast at dough balling. If you're dough balling up one dough ball at a time, doing this, it might take you 20 or 30 minutes after you get the dough out of the mixer to be able to get that dough divided up and put into the cooler. If that's the case, you might want to only go 10 or 15 minutes. Allow yourself that time frame. I can usually do up a 50-pound batch of dough balls in a matter of about 3 or 4 minutes. So it's pretty quick for me, but I'm an old guy. I've been doing this since the earth was cooling. So dividing and rounding, get it into the retarder. If you're doing it on sheet pans and you normally put them wrapped in plastic, don't plastic wrap them right away. Let the dough cool down. One of the major byproducts of yeast fermentation is heat. So if you can cool the dough balls down first and then bag them or wrap them how you want to do it, you're going to have much better control over your dough. If you're using totes, there's a lot of tote companies here this week. Utilize that cross-stacking method, which is basically you just bring the cart in with 10, 12, whatever Camber trays or types of trays you're going to use. Cross-stack the tray, just one like this, boom, 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 all the way up. Let them sit in there until the temperature gets down to about 45 to 47 degrees. Then nest them together. Nope, ball them, then put them in the cooler, and then allow them to cool so that they can dissipate the heat that's in that dough ball or is going to be in it if it gets stacked up too high. And then go ahead and nest them down and just push them into the corner. Yep, oil on them. I usually oil the pans, I oil the dough balls, and you don't need to get crazy about the oil. Don't dip them in oil. Just put a light coating on it, just so that it's enough to prevent them from drying out. And that'll help it a lot. And then you're going to go to warming the dough up. Usually I'll pull out 3 or 4 trays with a dozen skins on a tray or a dozen dough balls on a tray. And then you just pull them out gradually. You don't need to pull every one that you think you're going to use for that day out all at one time. Pull out 3 or 4 trays, let them warm up a little bit. Pull out 3 or 4 more trays, let those warm up at a different time, and just mark the time on the trays so that you know when you're pulling them out. The advantage of doing that is, as the day goes by, if business starts to slack off around 8 o'clock one night, you don't have to have 3 or 6 trays of product sitting out there trying to figure out what the heck you're going to do with it. You know, an average 1-pound dough ball costs about 21 to 25, 26 cents to make. But you're probably selling a pie for somewhere between $8 and $20. Don't utilize dough that is so overly fermented that you're going to lose customers because of 25 cents. It's not worth it. So dividing and rounding, you're basically going to scale the dough up at the proper weights, whatever those happen to be for you. You probably already know. Going to round them up, put them in the dough trays. In this particular case, you can see the Cambros. And then cross-stack them and let them cool. One method that I've done in the past is if you roll a stack of product into the cooler and once they're cooled, you nest them down, just bring an extra dolly in with you the next morning and down stack them in reverse. And then the very first ones you put on the bottom are back on the top where you can pull from them first. It's another control issue. Okay. Everything we just told you is baloney. If you're in trouble and you're out of dough. We're going to try to do everything we can do to get you to have dough within about 20 to 30 minutes. It ain't going to be good dough. And it probably wants to be thrown away the next day or the night before. But it will make a dough that you can make pizza out of. Hope that they're from out of town, never coming back, you know, that kind of deal. You'll probably double your yeast level. You will probably double your sugar level. If you didn't have any, add some. You're going to increase your water temperature or your dough temperature to probably about 95 to 100 degrees, which means you may need to use 100 to 120 degree water to do it. Mix the dough really quick and start balling it up or just use chunks of dough to make up your doughs. And don't try to put this in the cooler and keep it overnight because it will knock the door wide open. If you don't think that's true or possible, about 20 years ago now, there was a truck leaving Milwaukee headed for Green Bay. And all of a sudden, somebody stopped this truck to let them know that the doors on the back of their truck were open. And this wasn't a little truck. This was a 55-foot semi. And it was full of pizza dough, and the reefer system went down. And they spent about 6 hours cleaning up the highway with bulldozers and bobcats. It was horrible. And it smelled horrible. And the pigeons were on it, and the creatures were on it, and everybody was on it. It was disgusting. But that's kind of what it's about.
And if you're going to throw that dough out, throw it in the oven real quick. Otherwise, it's going to be
Bake
out
up
of your
chunks
dumpster.
of it.
Yeah.
Put it back in the mixer and add like 5 pounds of salt to it. That'll slow it right down. So, questions? Suggestions on what we can do to make it better? Yes, ma'am.
On that and on what that, I think it probably delays feasibility.
It does.
So,
Very much so.
is there any fix for that? I have my cake needed.
Well, you can have your cake, but you're not going to be able to eat it too, generally speaking. Ideally, if you're trying to do that, I'd suggest using fresh yeast. Don't use instant or active dry. It's a lot less damaged by that cold of a water temperature. In order to get 40 degree water, you're probably going to have to use quite a bit of ice. Dough temperatures, once you get down below about 62 degrees, it has a really rough effect on yeast, no matter the type of yeast at all. Frozen dough is run on very fast equipment at fairly low temperatures. Usually the temperatures of the dough coming out of the mixer are about 62 to 64. And you can't freeze frozen dough. Well, you can try to, but it's not going to last very long. You can't freeze frozen dough in a conventional freezer. It takes ammonia and sometimes nitrogen, depending on what you're doing. I hate using nitrogen because 300 and something degrees below zero is way too cold. You'll kill yeast at 135 degrees. So refrigerating for that length of time is really not the simplest thing to do. It takes a lot more work and a lot more dough conditioner in some cases. Strengtheners, maybe enzymes. There's a lot of stuff that's going on there. The dough is not pleased about doing that. Yes?
You said when the dough gets all stuck together like a giant mosh, whatever, you said there's too much yeast?
Too much yeast or over fermented. In general, I mean, it can be too much yeast, but it can also be caused by over fermenting the dough, period.
And that's leaving it out too long?
Leaving it out too long or letting it set too long in the cooler. Yes.
I store my instant yeast in the freezer. Is that a good or a bad?
It's what I do. And I worked for the instant yeast company for 24 years. It's the best way to store it if you can once the package is opened. If it's not been opened, it's got a 2-year shelf life at room temperature.
The dry ones, right?
Yep. Correct. Yeah, kick yeast is about 28 to 30 days is all.
Is that different than the safe yeast?
The safe yeast, SAF yeast, same thing.
It's active dry? Or is
It is both. It can be both. There is active dry and there is instant. Active dry is actually Red Star and instant is LaSaf or SAF. And they're different usage levels. Yes.
Why the freezer and not the refrigerator?
Freezers don't smell as bad as refrigerators, and the last thing you want to do is have it pick up some aroma or odor that's not pleasant. And it's just easier to store it in the freezer. You can use it right out of the freezer. It doesn't hurt a thing.
The other thing is your yeast is at risk because your refrigerator, when it gets in a defrost cycle versus a freezer when it goes in a defrost cycle, you get to a higher temperature, cooler, whereas your freezer pretty much stays 10 above, 20 above. You're going to get to that refrigerated temp versus 60, 65, 70. You get damage to yeast in that.
Yeah. Hopefully your cooler doesn't hit 65 or 70.
While we're on the storage thing, what's the adequate shelf life for flour?
What is an adequate shelf life for flour?
What is the shelf life for it?
It's approximately 1 year. I mean, we say it's 1 year. I think a lot of that is based more on absolute ideal conditions at 72 degrees with a humidity level of maybe around 50 or 60. If you're trying to store flour for a year in South Florida, it's probably going to be a problem. New Orleans is another problem. Jamaica is definitely a problem. Just be cognizant of where you're storing it. Try to keep it in a cooler environment as much as possible if you're in a very high humid area.
Whole wheat flour
Yeah.
won't store half that long because
It's got the germ still in it too.
that's going to go rancid very quickly.
Can you explain the yeast again? You said the Red Star was.
Red Star is active dry, and instant yeast is the SAF. Both from the same company.
Okay. And then both can be stored in the freezer?
Yep.
Or just- okay.
Yep.
Do you have to thaw them? Do you have
Nope.
to dump your own milk? Is it
No,
such a small percentage?
they're totally fine. You can take that yeast out of the fridge or out of the freezer before you even get it scaled. It's almost room temperature. Yeah. So, yes.
When you're doing a cross stacking with the dough tubs, what is the ideally what kind of time frame are you looking at for keeping them cross stacked before you know?
Well, obviously it's going to be relative to how good your cooler is operating. You want to be down around 36 to 38 or whatever it is that you need to have. Generally speaking, it's about 60 to 90 minutes. Yep.
Is that going to go up or down between those sides of the bowl?
It certainly will. Yep, a little 7-ounce dough ball is not going to take as long to cool down as a 28-ounce dough ball. So, okay. Yes. No, go.
Whole wheat and semolina dough earlier. You have to use whole wheat dough to absorb the water better. Did you do the same with semolina?
Yes. Semolina is a pretty hard granule, but it does take a little longer to hydrate. But it adds a really nice flavor to pizzas. Yes, ma'am. I was expecting that one last time. Whatever one pleases you. Quite frankly, I think using 100% olive oil is a complete waste of everyone's money in the room. They do make 80-20, which is about 80% soy and 20% olive oil. If you like a sweeter flavor profile, you may want to go with canola or corn. Corn is generally the oil of choice in Chicago-style pizzas. But soy, canola, they're all pretty bland in relationship to each other. Canola is just a tiny bit sweeter than the regular soy oil. It's also a tiny bit more expensive than regular soy oil. So depends on what you want to do. Very common. Very common. Does anybody use shortening or butter in their formulas? Do you sell a lot of slices? Chicago deep dish, yeah. That's another kind of a thing that some of them do. They'll add a portion of shortening and a portion of corn oil to it. So it makes that crust. I have a hard time eating Chicago-style crust because to me, eating pizza is like 4 or 5 slices and a couple of beers. If I have to order my pizza 55 minutes before I even get through the door, something's wrong with that place. Not to be mean, but oh yeah, that's what I need to do.
Yeah.
Yes. Actually, there's a lot of people that use milk. It's usually not in liquid form. It's usually non-fat dry milk or sweet dairy whey. If you're looking for a longer shelf life and you're afraid that you're going to lose some of the color on the finished crust, milk's a great way to resolve that issue. We just did a class on lamination at our culinary center last week. Oh God, no wonder I'm tired. And croissant dough, if it's made French style, doesn't use any water at all. It's 100% whole milk.
Some Asian doughs use milk.
Yep, some do. But it isn't uncommon to see just regular powdered milk. Non-fat, usually heat-treated non-fat dry milk. That way the enzyme, the casein enzyme is destroyed, so it doesn't affect the yeast activity at all.
So if you're using dry, how do you substitute? Do you use...
It's usually about a pound dry per gallon of milk. So it's about 12 to 16 ounces. It depends how good the milk is that you're working with. The majority of dry milk used in the industry today is used exclusively in bakery systems. So it's about 12 to 16 ounces of dry to about 7 pounds of water. Yes?
The only one that does not use salt in the dough?
Not that sells a lot of pizza. Salt it has a couple of functionalities. Number one, functionally, it increases the flavor profile of your dough. If you don't add it, it's kind of more of a cardboard sort of effect. You don't really have a lot of flavor to it, and you have virtually no fermentation control over the dough at all. I've made a lot of dough without salt, not intentionally, mind you, but I've done it. It's usually... No, it actually works in the reverse order because it's not salt that's actually doing the work. to soften the flour, or to soften the water. You have salt or salt brine going into the system, but that's not what changes the water. Yes?
I have two questions.
One at a time.
One was earlier about the olive oil. So I do use olive oil.
Sure.
Is it just a bit then? Does it change the flavor?
It depends on how much is in there. I sure know this. If you add 6%, it makes a green dough.
Adding 6%, so I guess.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah,
my
the
second,
green beer.
I do New York style pizza in Ohio. So, you know, everyone is always talking about the water, and I always thought that was just a big myth. Because I always thought my pizza tasted pretty good. But then today I'm at the pizza show, and this guy's obviously selling this whole equipment on New York style water, and it makes the big difference. Is it still a myth, or and that's just a big marketing ploy, or is there some truth to the components of the water in New York being different?
I don't know. Do you like water out of the Hudson? Think about that. In reality, if the water that you're using and the location you're in is meeting all the standards for making water or for producing water, it should be fine. There are a lot of companies that ship water all over this country, and that has got to be the most expensive package in the world. I did hear from someone that told me that there was a person here from New York earlier this morning who was not a happy camper that I said that. But he'd have to prove it to me.
Because he does get the water shipped in?
Yep.
Well, there's a piece of equipment there for
I know.
$200 he could buy. He could stop doing that.
Yeah. We could also just put in RO water for about a third of the cost and be just fine forever.
I have one question.
Sure.
In this retarded dough method, if you are dividing, you're mixing and then dividing. And then if you are wrapping it, let's say, cling wrap or something, does that change the fermentation process, or it freezes?
It does.
Storing it in the refrigerator for overnight use.
Yeah.
So will it change the fermentation process?
His question was if you're dividing the dough, balling it, wrapping it immediately in plastic wrap, and then storing it overnight, does it change the fermentation effect or flavor? It does, because it won't dissipate the heat as fast, so it ferments much, much faster. So the key is cool it down, then wrap it or bag it. Yes?
Supplementing this. Doesn't actually differentiate between the aerobic and anaerobic?
It definitely does. Yeah, and you want the anaerobic stuff and the aerobic stuff, not just one. You want both. Okay? Yes? Not until after it's cooled down. Cool it first.
Good.
Any thoughts?
Yeah,
Any idea what time it is?
almost 5.
Oh, wow, we went longer this time. That's awesome. I was trying to throw us out of here early because everybody was asleep on the floor. Okay, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact us.